recognizes
the ranking member for opening statement. I yield to the ranking member for an opening statement. I yield back.
Good morning, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Madam Chairman.
Distinguished gentlelady from California, Mary Bono. Gentlelady is recognized.
Chair now recognizes
The lady from California is recognized.
I'm pleased to introduce Congresswoman Mary Bono, former U.S. Representative for California's Inland Empire and Desert Region from 1998 to 2013.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself such time as I may consume.
Gentlelady is recognized.
Welcome to Sagely Speaking. I'm your host, Mary Bono, and I'm glad you're here. If you would please subscribe to our podcast and leave a 5-star rating or give us a thumbs up, depending on your platform, it would absolutely mean the world to us. And a special thank you to our sponsors for your support. Now let's get right to our guest, Dr. Andrew Weiner. Dr. Weiner is a board-certified psychologist and addiction specialist. He speaks nationally on the topics of addiction and behavioral health and the impact of drug policy on public health. His perspective is informed by his years of experience growing and directing addiction service lines for hospitals and healthcare systems, the current state of medical and psychological research, and his own observations, very importantly, in private practice, which means he's a hands-on kind of guy. Dr. Weiner, thank you for joining us on Sagely Speaking, and welcome.
Oh my gosh, it's my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Sure. Well, I'm going to get right into the meat of the matter here, if that's all right. And is it okay if I call you Aaron? If I call you Aaron? You're like half my age.
Please.
You should allow me to call you Aaron.
Yes. No, Aaron's totally fine.
Okay, good. So what are the psychological and behavioral underpinnings of addictions, and why do they matter?
Yeah. Well, they matter a lot right now because we're really struggling as a society with coping, which is ultimately what addiction is all about. My way of thinking about what addiction is it's a way of someone trying to achieve peace, whether it's from something that's internal, like depression, anxiety, or trauma, something external, stress in their life. But they found a way of doing it that seems in the short term like it works because it takes away pain very efficiently. It can even create pleasure very quickly, but it's not a clean burning fuel. There's a cost behind it. But the fact that we as a society right now have higher levels of depression and anxiety than we've seen in a very long time means that there's this increased need for figuring out what to do about it. And there's ways of doing it that are healthy and sustainable, and then ways of doing it that are less healthy and sustainable. And that's where addictive behaviors and substances come in.
Well, you mentioned there's a cost behind it. Obviously, there's more than just one cost. Can you go into that a little bit?
Yeah, certainly. Well, so it's like a trade-off, right? When you've got something that you're doing that's addictive, it can kick in very quickly, or it can take away what you're thinking about. It can occupy your mind, fog your mind, whatever it is. But the trade-off of that is it usually takes something either out of your physical health or mental health in the certainly moderate or long term. It also can put you at risk of negative outcomes, right? Like if someone gets completely drunk, for example, that means immediately they are at higher risk of getting in a car and having a crash, committing some sort of crime, having a domestic dispute. When you are intoxicated, you get to engage in more risky behavior, right? Your inhibitions go down, your judgment isn't there. And so it's a trade-off. And ideally in therapy, in psychology, what we're trying to teach folks to do is to work with the feelings that they have in ways that are sustainable so that they can both deal with the feelings, ideally relatively quickly, but not so in a way that ends up biting them in the butt down the line. This
is not limited to drugs or alcohol, right? And I know you're spelling all this out pretty clearly, and it is what you call the biopsychosocial model. All of this, that's a big, long word. And I had never heard that term before about maybe 10 years ago. Was it new, or was it newly created 10 years ago? Has it been around for a while? Biopsychosocial.
It's been around for a while, but I think it's been growing in popularity because the field of addiction psychology and of addiction treatment has been getting more and more sophisticated over time. And the science has been proliferating out into the more general milieu or society, if you will. What it means is that there's a biological, psychological, and social component to addiction. And what the biological side is usually what we focus on, right? Substance going in, maybe your brain down-regulating certain chemicals because you're getting it from the outside. There's this biological aspect. But in addition to that, there are psychological factors and social factors that keep that behavior locked in place. And so from the treatment side, if all we're doing is taking out the substances, or like you were saying, gambling, sex, pornography. There's other ways that you certainly can engage in addictive behaviors. That's only one part of the equation. There's still the element of psychologically, what is it doing for you, and how do you meet those needs in healthier ways? And then socially, a lot of times, if you've developed an addiction, you've either isolated yourself from healthy people in your life and perhaps burned some bridges, or surrounded yourself by people who are actively unhealthy for you and kind of spur the behavior on.
Yeah, I think when I look at this, as I listen to you talk, I think that this is throughout the American economy now too. I mean, social media. And I might be guilty of this. I realize I don't even know how many times I check my social media feed a day. But I've begun to realize, they know how often I'm checking my social media pages every day because they're monetizing it, right? There's a reason that they're doing it. So more and more and more industries are realizing, how do we get that brain to come, let's just call it habituated rather than addicted. Let's notch it down a little bit. How do we, what the heck?
Yeah, well, a lot of these that's another thing. Technology can be a very addictive thing as well, where they're designed oftentimes using very classic conditioning strategies actually to keep you coming back and back to the app, back and back to your phone. I've actually noticed, I don't know if anyone else, if you've had this experience, but where I have 3 dogs, I walk them a lot. And I found sometimes I'll just be walking my dog and I'll find that like my other free hand is just kind of like reaching into my pocket to like touch my phone as if it needs to be like, yeah, it's like, why am I touching that? So I've like taken to putting it in my back pocket when I walk, because it's like, that just creeps me out. I don't think I need to be touching my phone like it's some sort of security blanket, but it's true. We're just conditioned to go back and back and back to it.
Well, so my producer, Kim, who's listening in as we speak, she and I always talk about this because we're both really into hiking and doing the outdoorsy thing. I mean, not to the extreme that a lot of our friends are, don't get me wrong. We really are, hey, let's just go take a hike and clear our mind. Even then, it's kind of hard to leave your gadgets and your gizmos behind because you still feel that urge to grab it, to touch it. Wait, something's happening and I need to know instantaneously or else my life will not be the same ever, right?
I know, right? It feels so urgent. There was a study that came out recently. This one really got my attention that showed that the average attention span of a human being 20 years ago was at about 2.5 minutes that we could attend to something. Today, in 20 years, it's now dropped down to 42 seconds. And I think that really just, it's these push notifications, it's the speed of social, there's so much stimuli right now that we're used to, that trying to disconnect, get out in nature, take a hike, it feels like no pun intended, like a huge hill to climb, right? It's like a mountain trying to just disconnect.
Wait, what'd you say? I'm kidding, attention span.
Was your mind drifting? Yeah.
It wasn't, but I was just waiting to lay that on you because it happens all the time. But when you go through, I went right to social media. I don't know why. But when you go through, the American economy and businesses that sell addictive products, who are the most notorious in your mind, or the most notorious / effective? I guess it depends on which side of the P&L ledger you're on.
Oh man, well, it's been all throughout history, right? I think that there's some big players, right? Big tobacco is there historically. I think so. What it's all about, right, is that there are companies that understand we have these needs for stimulation, we have these needs for escapism, and so those needs are high right now. How can we get in and take as much as we can before we get shut down? Think like Purdue Pharma. Right, where there was a pain, pain was the 5th vital sign. They saw an opening. They used a misinformation campaign about it not being addictive and Oxycontin. And now all of a sudden, here we are in the middle of the opioid epidemic that played a huge role in. Or look at nicotine vaping, where there was all this advertising, lifestyle advertising towards very young people, honestly, younger than 21 years of age, in my opinion, that they were advertising to. And now we've got a huge proportion of young people, a lot larger than it should be, who are using these products. We've got the THC world as well, right? With this big rebrand around THC, marijuana, cannabis, etc., that now is just growing and growing and growing. And we're seeing those rates increase just dramatically amongst young adults in particular. It changes substance over time, and gambling now, I should mention as well. I'm really going. It's like sports betting. I'm based out of Illinois. Sports betting has just exploded since the Supreme Court left it up to the states and Illinois jumped in. We're seeing more gambling issues than ever before. So there are businesses that understand that you make money off of addiction. And they push into those spaces when the openings are there, and regulations haven't kept up with the speed of the business there. And so that leaves us healthcare professionals to try to play catch up.
I'm glad you brought up vaping, because that just came across my desk earlier today again. And when you think about the people who are manufacturing these illegal vape products that our children are getting a hold of and our children are using, they are coming from China. And the very same regions of China that are manufacturing the fentanyl are manufacturing these vape products in delicious flavors, tutti frutti, bubblegum, you name it, mango, and they're all deliberately enticing for kids.
Yeah.
And so, Aaron, why can't we have better policies where we can, again, if an adult wants to vape a, healthy product that isn't coming from China with absolutely unknown quantities of whatever element is in it, isn't there a way to allow adults to do what adults want to do, but help prevent kids from doing something like vaping at 12 years old, 11 years old, and now even younger kids are picking up these vape products and they think, oh, this is really delicious. Let me take a hit. Can't we do better on the public policy front?
Well, we absolutely can. I mean, I think there's always this balance, right? Or if you could even call it that, but it's a trade-off between public health and money. Right, when it comes to addictive substances, it would be very easy to shut a lot of this down in a more comprehensive way. Although, to be honest with you, some of it also comes down to enforcement. You were mentioning these illegal vape products. They are all actually illegal, but there's no enforcement up and down the line, or there's kind of like this whack-a-mole enforcement where you like smack one company down and another springs up to take its place. In my opinion, if we were trying to get out there and say, hey, we want vaping to be a harm reduction approach for smoking. We want people off smoking, on vaping instead. Why aren't they behind like the pharmacy counter, right? Like if you wanted to get a blueberry vape or a strawberry vape, why are those not can those not be a medical product if that's actually what they're for? I think that there might be some steps that could be done, particularly for the flavors and products that are most appealing to kids, to actually make them less accessible, either with enforcement or with positioning it actually in a health space, which is, theoretically what it was supposed to be, but never ended up that way.
Well, let's get into this a little bit. The enforcement issues. Why wouldn't they enforce it? One of my favorite axioms, and this came from my late husband, Sonny, he would say, if it's illegal, enforce the law. If they're illegal, why wouldn't they be enforcing the law? What is missing here? Is it they're undermanned, underfunded? They just don't see the importance of the issue? What is the reason they're not getting these illegal vape products off of shelves?
Yeah, I think that's what it's about, honestly. I'm obviously not internal to the federal. You might know more about this than I do in terms of how difficult it is to enforce these things. But my understanding is that it's difficult to enforce them coming in certain ways, but then even locally, right? You can walk around. There's a fantastic researcher out of Texas, Dr. Matt Rosheim, who's done a lot of work on the semi-synthetic THC products like Delta 8, Delta 10, those sorts of things out of vape shops. And what he's found is that even in states that have bans on selling these products, 46% of vape shops in those states sell those products. They're just there on the shelf to be bought. And so I think whether or not we're talking about local enforcement of retail vendors selling it, as well as how it gets into the country in the first place, I think that there's room for improvement all up and down the line. You're far more of an expert than I am from a policy standpoint about how you get something done and where the weakest link is there in terms of trying to strengthen it. But I think that there's a lot of opportunity.
We'll continue with our interview in a moment, but first I'd like to thank my sponsors. Lucy Pet Foods is the leader in gut health. Their formulas for life feature prebiotic, balanced fiber that nourishes your dog and cat's total health. Every purchase helps support the Lucy Pet Foundation, a 501c3 charity helping animals. Save 15% off your first order and use the promo code SAGELYSPEAKING, all one word, and you will get free shipping at lucypetfoods.com. If you're committed to tackling the opioid and addiction crises, then you need to be at the 2025 RX Summit. Use code SAGELY, that's SAGELY, for an extra $100 off. Join top experts and professionals as we share strategies for prevention, deflection, treatment, and recovery. Don't miss this chance to be part of the change. Head over to rx-summit.com to register now. That's rx-summit.com for an additional $100 off. And a thank you to Mothers Against Prescription Drug Abuse, driving solutions to prevent drug abuse and overdose deaths by focusing on prevention through education and awareness. Go to MAPTA.net for more information. And now, back to our interview.
Well, it's sad about these vape products is they have unknown levels of nicotine, and obviously that's the addictive property of these products, and kids are getting them, and then they're off and running with this nicotine habit. But let's go to, you brought up manufactured THC products, synthetic. Mm-hmm. With the conversation in America has changed so much that people have loosened the fear of drugs. They have constantly now we're being hit with billboards and all sorts of things. Have your marijuana delivered to your house and whatever these messages might be. And you're quite young. In your experience, have you seen a change for better or for worse in the messaging to America about the dangers of these products? And conversely, the importance of wellness and mental health and what you ought to do to protect yourself, especially when we're being bombarded by messages all the time. And I'll say, I will more likely notice a THC billboard. Like you can be outside of LAX, Los Angeles International Airport by 5 minutes and be bombarded with these billboards. I will notice those a lot more frequently than I will a billboard telling you about the dangers of fentanyl. And so obviously, who's winning here, the interests of the marijuana industry. But have we somehow just sort of lost our way on telling our kids and giving them the tools that they need? You talk about coping. Are we giving them enough tools for coping at a young age and all the way through high school and college?
Yeah. Really important question. I think there's a couple of parts to the answer. So I guess starting at the end and then going back to the beginning, our kids right now truly are struggling. There's a reason why the Surgeon General declared there to be an epidemic in youth mental health problems, why he's talking about putting a black box warning on social media apps. There's a huge problem. Actually, the most recent youth risk behavior survey was just released, I think, 2 or 3 years ago, months ago, looking at 2023 data. So it's updated every 2 years. So this is actually very recent, all things considered. And what we found is that still there's about 2 in 5 kids, teenagers, who self-report having clinical depression. 1 in 10 kids in high school says that they attempted suicide in 2023. 1 in 10, although only about 1 in 5 makes it to a physician or a nurse. But even if that 1 in 10 kids trying to kill themselves right now, that's a huge problem. And to me speaks to the need systemically we have to truly equip kids to deal with the realities they're facing, because arguably their lives are more stressful. Like back when any of us were children, there was no cyberbullying the way there is now. School shootings are so much more prevalent. I mean, there's so much that they're worrying about right now that they weren't worrying about before. And we have not scaled up our support to match. So that's certainly an issue. What has scaled up, though, you're mentioning, are these businesses, right, that are swinging in. Although, I'll do a slightly different take here. I think that what's happening is that there are different, I don't know if it's necessarily worse now, but I think it shifts. I think if you look back a couple decades and you look what was going on, say, for example, with Joe Campbell and right, and what was going on with alcohol advertising, there's like these ebbs and flows with different substances as the public either gets different information or different political parties have more power. I found that each party seems to have their own vices, for lack of a better word for it, that they tend to favor and promote, and others that they tend to not and to hold back, as opposed to us all having a unifying strategy of saying, hey, we should probably be disincentivizing use of these products and these behaviors because it's ultimately unhealthy for our public to be doing it. Not to say that we need to take away freedom of choice in all respects of what people do, but at the same time, yeah, I think billboards advertising vaping or THC products are wholly unnecessary. I don't think that that's anything that it does the public good at all. And there are, I think on the gambling front, I'm sure almost everyone's seen these ads about how you get $1,500 back or something in bonus bets with your first bet with an online betting site, which is literally, without going into the nitty gritty of it, teaching you to do something called chase your losses, which is one of the hallmarks of gambling addiction. And so these companies are training people to do this from their very first bet. So there are certain things that we allow to have happen right now, predatory business tactics, and even advertising that doesn't have to happen, yet we allow it. And I think there's a tremendous opportunity there to help everybody, but certainly our kids who are soaking this all in.
It's funny. This reminds me of an old story, an experience I had. I'm an art history major. I mean, don't ask me how or why I ended up there, but I did. I started pre-med and ended up in art history. Life straight, rich pageantry, as a friend of mine would say.
You didn't want a job when you graduated. I think that's why.
I did. I was going to go to grad school and yada, yada, yada. Life just took its own twists and turns. But I remember actually talking to somebody who was studying anthropology. And I thought anthropology at that time, I'm thinking, what are you going to do in anthropology? You're going to study ancient people and pygmies and things that really have no relevance to today. I put it with a great thing to do if you love to do it. But again, talking about not having a job. And she looked at me and she said, Mary, it's easy. I know, and I'm going to know more. I know what you want before you know you want it. And I didn't really get it at the time, but I get it now, especially you're in the analogy here on gambling. It's like, let's put this out there. And look, this could be in any area. It's beyond gambling. It's shopping. Right. Shopping is another one. There's all sorts of these issues, but this I know what you want before you know you want it thing really struck me, because I think that the economy is more that way now than ever. I think we've figured out so much with brain science and dopamine and what hits the reward center, and man, is it hit all the time. But with public policy, where would you attack this? What would you do? You think the political leaders and figures and just they don't care about this, or they're not educated enough, or what has to be done? What would you do? Let's say somehow you end up running for office in some sort, way, shape, or form. And there you are. Do you have a list of the top 3 things you would do to try to address these things?
Oh man, I think we could probably come up with like a top 3 for each category, right? Like, what do we need to do to actually bolster mental health in our country from a preventative sense? What do we need to do to help with the youth epidemics around addiction and mental health? What do we need to do for, we've mentioned gambling a few times. There's opportunities there. I think ultimately what it comes down to, if I was going to distill it down to one area that I think is perhaps the most important right now that we're not doing, is not just prevention, although that's important, but I'd say secondary prevention. And what I mean by that is that prevention, I should mention, is very tough to fund, because it's like effectiveness is like proving a negative, right? It's very hard to say we're investing in this and we can see that it's very hard to prove that with numbers. And so it's hard to get money for that. And at the same time, being in the field of mental health, I can tell you that we are absolutely just there's so much need that it's almost impossible to meet. But people, by the time they make it to a psychologist like me, there's probably been a problem that's been growing for years and years and years, that's been getting worse, where people have been perhaps afraid to talk about it, don't know what to do about it. And there's no early intervention available, no prevention. And secondary prevention, what that gets at is saying there's the start of a problem, but can we stop it from getting worse? And that's, I think, when we talk about the opioid epidemic, like when we talk about overdoses for opioids, these are folks who have, in many cases, fentanyl notwithstanding, because it is contaminating a lot. But if we take that accidental exposure out of it for a second, a lot of time, by the time you're using street drugs or injecting heroin or buying fentanyl from folks off the street, you've gone down a long path to get to that point. And we focused a lot on the very beginning. We focused a lot on the very end, if we want to talk about opioids for a second with overdose, but we're not focusing so much on that, in many cases, years-long pipeline from when someone initiates their drug use of any sort, recreational drug use, to the point where they get to using street drugs and heroin and fentanyl and overdosing. So I think that would be the top thing for me. How can we actually fund and invest in programs that support people who need help, but where the problem hasn't metastasized and gone systemic? And how do we rein in the businesses that are profiting off of others' misfortune in very just common sense ways around advertising and business tactics?
Aaron, do you think there's enough surveillance data out there for people to act on what's happening, all of these ills, before they really become a crisis? When I look at the opioid crisis, anecdotally and in our congressional districts, we saw numbers beginning to pile up. But it took the government a long time to say, okay, now we see the data, let us do something. And I think that was very frustrating, but you're on the front lines. Do you feel there's a huge lag between what you're seeing and the response to it?
I would agree with that. I think that we tend to be, and this is getting back to the prevention versus treatment side of things. There's proactivity and reactivity, and I think we tend to be very reactive about public health problems. And some of that's understandable, right? Like you're saying, there needs to be this preponderance of data. We need to make sure it's not a fluke. This is a real problem, particularly if you're looking at it at a large systemic level. At the same time, though, that means you're always playing catch up. And sometimes there are these problems and trends that are so entrenched at that point that it's so much tougher to get them out than if we were more nimble, more quick, able to listen. I remember in terms of the opioid epidemic, when things were first really coming to light and it was coming into the news, the numbers were rising. I was working as the director of an addiction service line at a multiple hospital system. And I remember very clearly before there were any mandates, before all of this was going on, there were task force meetings about this, saying, "Hey, we want to do right by our community. What can we do at the level of our individual health system to not be contributing to this problem, and then ideally also be part of the solution?" But it was taking, particularly in the beginning, that sort of effort on the local level where people have the will, they have the resources, they want to do the right thing. I think where government can come in and do so much good is to set the bar higher for everybody sooner. And it is so tough unless it's someone's, it's their pet issue, right? Where they're paying attention to it and they care about it, to get the word out earlier. I mentioned the Surgeon General around youth mental health, around social media. I think, again, he's done a great job of saying some pretty strong statements earlier on than it might have been done otherwise. We're still waiting, though, to see a response because, he obviously can't do it on his own.
This model that you just mentioned, your work in the hospital system, is fascinating to me. I don't hear that very often. Is that something that we're beginning to see more in hospital systems, or, whether they're small or large, across the country? Because we're somebody to actually ask the question, what do we do right? How do we do right by our patients with these drugs that can become addictive? A lot of great work seems it could happen there. Is that a model we're seeing more often?
Yeah, I think it's variable across the country, but I can tell you, so again, I'm in the Chicago area, and there's a very robust group of people who are very interested in these sorts of public health outcomes. And certainly, again, right at the beginning of the opioid epidemic, and even as it was ongoing before funds came in from some of these lawsuits and such, there were county level work groups, there were regional work groups, sharing of information, there were symposia, which again weren't being necessarily spurred on by government, but it was by people saying, "Hey, like there's folks dying," and those of us in healthcare in particular, we are seeing it, right? We are not only seeing it, but we're working with the folks who are struggling, might have overdosed and been revived. That's again where part of my passion comes around this issue of pushing back on business that is selling addictive products, is that I treat the people who are the human fallout of these policies. I'm one of those people cleaning up and trying to help the folks who are harmed. And that's ultimately what pivoted me towards speaking and education, is that I think it's so important to go upstream and inform people to make different choices.
And you're right. And you said proving prevention is nearly impossible, and it is. We wrestle with this every day. But you would think in a closed loop system like a hospital system, you could actually be sort of a pilot program and prove that this works, whether it's readmissions or whatever it might be. But I would think you'd be very successful, or more successful, at tracking prevention there. But advocates like me on the front who are just into prevention, and you try to get funding and they say, well, prove it. It's like, well, we do all we can. But, the good news is the CDC we've shown a little tiny downtick in overdose deaths and use, and which is great. We have a long way to go. But when you see statistics going the way you want them to go, you want to do more of what you're doing right, and lots more of it. So, but there's a governmental response, and in my view, the federal government, of course, didn't do enough with the FDA regulated manufacturers and distributors. That's one thing. But now let's go down to the parental level. And what my little team at Mothers Against Prescription Drug Abuse, which includes Kim, my producer, what we've really learned is that we so often say to parents, hey, have you had the talk with your child about the dangers of the pill supply, the illicit pill supply? And I've said this to, like a mother whose child is going to freshman year of college, and they go, oh, I don't need to have that talk. My kid's a good kid. And I don't think you can waste a conversation, though. So I don't want people to sit back and say it's all the government's responsibility. They have to do it all, because we have to recognize at the same time there are things we need to do as a parent. My point of my filibuster here is to say, why can't we seem to break through with messaging on prevention? Or maybe we are, because the numbers are trending a little bit the right way. But it's really hard to get the message across to folks that this can happen to anybody.
Yeah. I think it's uncomfortable. I think it's uncomfortable for parents to talk about it. I also think it's uncomfortable to think about it. And it's very difficult sometimes to have not even just one conversation. There's a phrase, not to contradict you, but there's a phrase that I really love.
I'm all about contradiction.
There's a phrase that we really love here. I did not make this up, but in my prevention coalition that I'm part of in my local area, that 61-minute conversations are more important than one 60-minute conversation. And I think that is so true, where it's something that you just stay in touch with your kids about and you talk about. It's not taboo. It's not uncomfortable. We just talk about the realities and the dangers that are out there and have an open line of communication with our kids about it. Because ultimately, you are, as a parent, are not going to be there when your child is offered a joint or a vape or a pill or a line of Coke or whatever. It's going to be without an adult present, and they have to have the information that they need. And sometimes the skills, right, to say no, but they need to be equipped to get through that situation in a safe and healthy way. And absolutely, it's not on the government to make sure that our kids are equipped that way. There's contextual factors I think that policy can help with, but all of us parents, myself included, we need to be talking with our kids and staying in touch about what they see, what's going on in their world, what's happening on their phones. The vast majority of drug deals that are being done right now that aren't in person at school are on Instagram and are on Snapchat. It's where it's happening,
Absolutely, yes. And I think there's a lot of work underway to try to rein that in, but it's a real threat. It's, we talk about the threat of isolation and all of the bullying and all that on social media, but you talk about kids being deliberately targeted by bad guys, by bad actors, and these are not your street level dealer. These are criminal organizations using this technology to target our kids. But Aaron, why is it hard to have this talk with our kids? It shouldn't be hard.
Yeah, well, so there's that internal element, I think, from the parental side where it's hard to talk about, hard to think about. I think there's also pushback potentially from kids. If say, for example, there's already a problem going on, right? And like mom and like you guys just don't understand, or it's hard, it's hard to have those types of confrontations if there's a confrontation that needs to happen one way or another. It's difficult to preemptively talk about something that makes us uncomfortable. I mean, in many ways, that's what procrastination is all about, right? We don't want to think about something because there's like this anxious repulsion factor, but we got to push through it. It's one of those things as parents. I know there's a lot of parents out there who are doing a fantastic job of this. And thank you to all listening who have talked with your kids about it. But if you haven't, consider bringing it up and just asking. A great way to break the ice actually is asking them what they're seeing at school and their friends. Don't ask them like, are you doing this? Are your friends doing this? Don't start there. That can kind of come up, be very standoffish, can get more of a difficult response. But if you haven't talked about this before, just say like, hey, like, I've heard there's a lot of vaping going on right now in the teenage world. Is this something that you've seen at school? Is this around you very much? What have you seen? And, just you can break the ice that way. It doesn't have to be personal or threatening.
On that note, I've been pleased with this podcast for a lot of reasons, but one of my most exciting moments was we talk about Narcan and the importance of carrying Narcan or naloxone or whatever your overdose reversal medication of choice is and whatever is available. We talk about that. And I've had a couple of people reach out and they say, I've armed my child with it who's in high school. Not that I think they will use, because I'm not giving them a license to use, and I'm not going to think they're going to, but they know that they will most likely be present at some emergency at some point in time, and I want them armed. And I thought, well, if that message got out and just a few parents have heard it on the importance of being prepared in the case of an overdose emergency, then I would consider this work a success. But I want to pivot to my last thing with you. It's so hard once you find a loved one, and I'm looking at you as a psychologist, Aaron. When you have a loved one who's found themselves addicted to something, there's no shame in getting help. It's so important. I'm a huge believer in therapy and in getting help and reaching out. it's a disease that there's no manual for, or the treatments aren't traditional, or the response of your friends and family isn't going to be traditional. And so I'm a huge believer in the role of a therapist in your life at times like this and helping you walk the journey that you're going to have to walk to get through it. Or what do you say to somebody who comes into you or isn't seeking help yet, but you know they need it? How do you get them to say it's okay to seek help?
So that's always tough, right? Because they have to see it for themselves. And a lot of times when folks come and talk with me, because I'm an addiction specialist, they've got some idea that what they're doing is destructive. I'd say the tougher one is when family members come to me. I get a lot of consultation calls about that, where someone's son, daughter, husband, wife is calling, like, and saying, like, I'm concerned about my loved one. What I can say is that I think that we as a society have a long way to go in terms of looking at addiction as a health condition and not as, say, just simply a choice. And I think that because there's still this layer of stigma over it, where we feel like, you might feel okay talking to your doctor about the fact that you think you have strep throat, or that you might have like an autoimmune condition, like you would go in there for that, or heart condition. But so many folks that I talk to are afraid to talk to their primary care doctor about medications for alcoholism, right? Like they can't talk to that even to members of their healthcare team. And I think that if we can say, hey, this is a health condition, for the most part, I think people feel shame many times that they continue to act in this way that's causing harm to themselves and other people in their life, when ultimately what's happening is they are trapped because they were trying to find peace in a way that felt extremely alluring. It's been a trap that so many people have fallen into. And once you're in it, there's chemical hooks that get in, there's neurological, that your brain starts shifting in terms of how it responds. And then you are trapped. It's like a web that getting out of can be very challenging without help for a lot of folks. And so I would, if anyone listening is struggling, or you have a loved one and they're listening, just to know it can be very challenging. And yes, whether or not it's a peer support group like a 12-step fellowship or Smart Recovery, a therapist like myself, an IOP program, intensive outpatient, or residential, there's so many ways to get over that hump. And if someone's trying and trying and trying and doesn't get there, that doesn't mean that there's no hope. It just means that you got to pull out a new tool and use that.
But if they're not ready for help, that's one of the most frustrating parts of loving somebody with a substance use disorder. I'm ready for them to get help. Why aren't they ready?
Oh, that is so tough, right? And so, that's a whole nother line. We probably talk for another hour just about that. Like, what do you do? I think ultimately, though, what I would say is, if you are loving someone who has an addiction, make sure, one, that you're taking care of yourself, because that's a roller coaster. When you care about someone's health and well-being seemingly more than they do, and you're along for that ride, that puts you in a very precarious place in terms of your mental and emotional health. So just, one, be mindful of that. And two, everything you do, just make sure it's through the lens of, is this moving them closer to health, or is this potentially sustaining them where they are? And is it more of just a treading water? Which is not to say that there's any one right or wrong answer in any situation, but if you are approaching interactions from, does this move them closer to recovery? Does this move them closer to stability and functionality in their life? That is the most, in a sustainable way. That's the best you can do, but it's so tough, so tough.
It's tough, but it's possible. It's possible if you believe, and if you have help and the right support group and a whole bunch around you. And people wonder, I talk so much about these issues on my podcast, and I talk about other things too, but a lot about this because I think a lot of this is preventable. And if we talked about it more, did more, studied it more, innovated more, that a lot of this could be reversed or prevented. And that is why I talk about it, because especially overdose deaths, most of them, many of them are preventable. They do not have to happen if we just talk about these issues and do a little bit more. I know that with every bone in my body. So that's why I talk so much about it. I feel like it's my role to do something, to do whatever I can. But Aaron, is there a way people can reach you? Do you have a website, or how can they learn more about you?
Yeah, I'm at weinerphd.com, and my email is just aaron@weinerphd.com, and you're welcome to reach out if you have questions. I pride myself on being very accessible.
Well, thank you very much for that. And I'm going to thank you so much for being here on Sagely Speaking. You're a pleasure and a wealth of knowledge, and I'm really glad that you came by to spend an episode with us, and I hope you'll come back in the future and keep us posted on all of your activities.
Thanks so much for having me.
You're very welcome. And thank you for joining us, all of my listeners, and thank you to our sponsors. We couldn't do this without you. Until next time, stay positive and keep exploring. We'll catch you on the next episode. Take care.